Just to put it in a nutshell, like most people, you don't really come to Marxism by reading a book, like most people. Yeah, I came to Marxism secondarily. I got interested in struggles and protests, and why things were going wrong in the world, and you know, and then discovered that, well, the people who were doing the kind of protests I like were all communists, and they were the most sort of disciplined people. They were not yelling insults at anybody. They really seemed disciplined, and that appealed to me. I mean, one part of me wanted to just go and fight the police, which I did at some point and paid a little price for it. But that's just stupid, to go and just get into a fight. It's much more important to work to build the confidence of working class and peasants, large numbers of people, to get involved. If you go and have a fight with a cop, you don't give people confidence to try to change the world. And I learned that pretty young. Like most people, the first Marx book I read was the Communist Manifesto, which, truly, if people haven't read it, it's a prose poem. It's a beautiful text, and I was actually surprised
And one
how
one
firstly,
can one can read it in one go. It's so short.
yeah, especially the first part, actually, before you get to the sections on, because there's stuff at the end, on the literature of the socialists and all that. Just the first part is elegant and beautiful. And you're right, you can read it in a sitting, yeah? And it's poetry. And I could understand everything. Like, that was the surprise to me. Because people said, Marx is very hard. And I thought, really? Because in this text, he says things like, under pain of compulsion, I'm talking about the old translation, under pain of compulsion, you got to adopt the capitalist mode of production. If you don't, they attack you, or sometimes they subordinate your old forms of labor, slavery and so on, in order for your products to enter the capitalist economy. And he writes about that, and he talks about wars and how wars are used to get resources. It all just made sense to me. I was like, wow, this describes the world. Like, nothing else I'd read described my reality in, let's say, 1986 as vividly as a text written in 1848. It's bizarre, I hadn't read anything as vivid. And I loved, at that age, and even now, I loved reading poetry. I loved listening to songs with great lyrics. I love music, but I love songs with really good lyrics. I love poetry. I
Your
adore poetry.
your most of your articles at the Tricontinental ends with a poem.
I just adore the way a poet can condense emotion. In a line, they condense emotion. And Marx does that. Even the first line of the manifesto, yeah? A specter is haunting Europe. It's such a beautiful line. And so I got into Marx through the Communist Manifesto. And then, like most people, I read bits and pieces here. I bought, in 1981, I bought 3 volumes of Capital, but, I didn't read it till much later. I bought it because at Progress Publishers, they used to set up the table in my school, and I bought Tolstoy. They were like, 1 rupee a book, big giant book, or 50 paisa. You could pay 2 rupees and get 3 the volumes. It was so cheap. Yeah, the Soviets were giving away books, and I bought lots of books. I had lots of these Soviet books, and I would read them and give them to my friends because they were cheap. Turgenev, Tolstoy, the old 19th century classics, Chekhov. I read all of them because cheap. Yeah, my school library had them, but whatever, doesn't matter. Marxism made sense to me, and then when I started reading Kwame Nkrumah, I got a little of that. When I started, Ho Chi Minh was always, just as an idea, was like a hero of mine. I didn't read anything, didn't know anything about him, but he was a heroic figure, Ho Chi Minh defeated the Americans. And so when I started reading him, I was just captured by his writing because, I was captured by what he said about communists. What should a communist be like? And in fact, this is a lesson for people to live as humans, not just as communists. He talks about something called emulation, that as you grow up as a person, you should emulate people that you admire. You should try to be like them. In fact, this is a very old philosophical idea, that the way you become a moral person isn't to be an individual and to seek a better way to be yourself. The best, you know how they say you should be the best version of yourself. You don't know, you need role models. And that's exactly what he was talking about, emulation. And I found people to emulate, and I found that a very enriching way to grow up. And so Marxism for me was always a total science of the world, including how to be a person. It wasn't just how to analyze. And you read Lenin, how to be disciplined. And for Lenin, to be disciplined isn't to be obedient. It is to have a sharp mind, to sharpen your thinking about the world, to work to build collectively a worldview. That's what it means to be in a party. You build a worldview collectively. You see the world together, even if you have differences. By and large, you see all of this appealed to me. I didn't want to be an individual. I wanted to be in groups. I wanted to build things with people. I wanted to, as they say, rescue the collective life, which had been eroding. And so for me, that's Marxism. It's all of that. It's not just, the extraction of surplus value, which I think is like a finding for Marx that's extraordinary. Yeah, but it's all of this. It's Lenin, it's Ho Chi Minh, it's Walter Rodney. Go on and on. It's like a world of movements of the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. The people fighting in Mozambique and Angola against the Portuguese. It's all of that. These people provided a kind of Marxism that excited me, and I must say, towering above all this was two thinkers who I really emulated and grew from. One was Mao Zedong. I really thought that he was an extraordinary builder in such a poor country, to have defeated so much, to have built the confidence of the people. And even as a young person, I admired the Chinese Revolution. I never was taken by Naxalism or armed struggle in India. I always thought that was a little crazy. It's not going to, India, the state is too strong for that kind of thing. But Mao appealed to me, yeah, and the other was Fidel Castro. I just found, I was gripped, and I was so lucky to meet him several times. I was gripped by his personality and how he thought also of Marxism, not just as a science of understanding society, but a way of living in the world, how to be a person, and he, I think, fashioned himself as somebody to emulate. And in a whole world, I mean, we all emulated him. We all wanted to be like Fidel. If you gave me a choice, would you rather be like Che Guevara or Fidel? I would say it's an unfair choice, but I emulated Fidel. I wanted to build something. It's really hard to build socialism, really, really hard. And I admire people like, Lenin, Mao, Fidel, these people who were given the responsibility,
Che,
by struggle to build things. It's incredible.
sorry, I can't resist asking this choice between Che and Fidel also brought to my mind the choice between Trotsky and Stalin. I know that would be somewhat different given Trotsky. Stalin is so much mired in history, so much it's much more loaded than Che and
actually not for me. It's not loaded for me, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I think within left movements, there are often disputes, and you can look at this doctrinally and so on. But I think there's something more than that here. Leon Trotsky came from an extremely fortunate background. He was well read as a child. He came from an upper middle class family. He was very bright. He wrote beautifully. Yeah, he was a very sincere and good communist. Stalin's mother was a domestic worker. He didn't have the intellectual advantages of Trotsky. He was an extraordinarily good organizer. I mean, because he came from the very poor end of the working class, he could speak to the working class. He built the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, with his working class hands. That group of Bolsheviks were people who came from the lower end of the working class. And I think there's a very unfortunate comparison made between Stalin and Trotsky when you look at their writings. One is a highly erudite person who comes from an upper middle class family, can quote from, this source and that source. The other comes with a great deal of anger at the bourgeoisie. anger at the elite, and hates the elite. He has what I would call genuine hatred. That's what Stalin had. Genuine hatred of the nobility. I mean, he knew how badly his mother had been treated. If you read, biographies of him, that's an impact on somebody like that. So for me, if you say Stalin or Trotsky, I say, well, let's look at their backgrounds and let's see, what Stalin was able to do from his background. I mean, okay, there's all kinds of horrible things you can list. At the end of the day, Stalin disagreed with Bukharin. Bukharin said, look, this is the path to development for us. And Bukharin was right. But Bukharin's path, Stalin saw, would take decades. Yeah, it was a very good way to industrialize. Bukharin's plan was excellent. This is how we're going to deal with the peasantry, blah, 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 do some collectivization, but it was going to take decades. Stalin said, we don't have decades. They're going to invade us. They're going to destroy us. And he made a choice there. We have to go for industrialization. It has a lot of grief attached to Stalin's economic policy, because that meant super rack-rented situation for the peasantry. Yeah, but they industrialized. And because of that, and because of the sacrifice of 25 million Soviet citizens, fascism was destroyed in Europe. Britain would be speaking German and they would be saluting statues of Adolf Hitler without Stalin's choice. Yeah, quite frankly, And so, in my opinion, if you look at it from that point of view, in my opinion, from that point of view, it is very, very clear to me. Okay, to me, it's very clear that you can't make a choice like Stalin versus Trotsky and say, let's choose between this guy's writings and this guy's gulags. If you make it, because that's what happens with Stalin versus Trotsky. It's that, Trotsky is great to read. His texts are so interesting and they're so filled with brilliant insights. Yeah. And in quotes from, literature and so on. And this guy is the gulag. He sent people to death. If you have that choice, well, it's an obvious choice. Yeah. But then if you look at the big picture, it's a much more difficult choice. And I'm not saying I'm willing to make a choice, but I think in my description, I really understand. And I think people don't understand what it meant to be from that level of the working class. I mean, if you look at the totality of the Bolsheviks, most of them come from the working class and the lower end of the working class, many of them. Cecilia Bobrovskaya, whose memoir we published from Leftwards, incredible book, was Lenin's courier. She used to go from the Tsarist Empire to see Lenin in Geneva, wherever he was, to give him books and, smuggle newspapers and download to him what was happening in the party in Russia. They would walk for hours, she writes in her memoir. She grew up in a household, mother was working, father was a rabbi, or, he was a Talmudic scholar, never did a lick of work in the day. She grew up in a household with abject poverty. That's the Bolshevik I admire, not people like myself, who come from families, who have libraries, who can quote poetry at will. I don't admire somebody like me. I admire somebody like Cecilia Bobrovskaya, who comes from real abject poverty, becomes a Bolshevik, studies, reads. After the Russian Revolution, Lenin is sitting in his office, yeah, and he asks people, "Where's Bobrovskaya? We've won. Now where is she?" Well, finds out she's living in in squalor, yeah. Really bad condition, and she's no position and she's in a bad way. So Lenin says, no, Bobrovskaya must live in Moscow near us. And he does something incredible. He opens a building called the Society of Old Bolsheviks. Okay. And he sets up people like Bobrovskaya to live in there. They have a common kitchen and so on, a library. And he tells them, you have a task. You guys now, all of you are old. You are going to write your own memoirs in little booklets, and you're going to write the history of our party, what all you did. And that literature, I have a lot of those. The Soviets translated them as well. Little pamphlets, biographies of different Bolsheviks, and those who died. They remembered and wrote things about those who died. That is one of the most beautiful parts of the October Revolution, that all these old communists who had built the revolution, then lived together, yeah, in this sort of commune, and they were tasked with producing their histories. And if you read those, you'll cry. Because most of these Bolsheviks come from like artisanal families, factory workers, and the low end of the working class, meaning they were, loaders, people who walked around carrying big loads because then they could smuggle newspapers. Yeah, I admire them. Stalin comes from there. Let's not forget that. That's all.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.